Here at what are some things, what are some of those statements that either we utter out loud, or sometimes we could find ourselves kind of just thinking. And what are some ways this can show up? As we start to think about here, when we don't understand generational trauma, when we don't understand the parents, many times we could start to, judge them. We could start to shame them ourselves, whether we're intending to or not. And we could find ourselves starting to say things like, you don't love your child. It's almost like if you loved your kid, you'd be acknowledging what happened to them. If you loved your kid, you would have gotten help for them the moment this happened. Even as I say that, it also just reminds me how many issues intersect. So even as we think about trauma and even just the issue of poverty, because I've also seen times where it's been hard sometimes, particularly, and as we think about this, what is this like when not only are we thinking about generational trauma being cycles of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse be transmitted in the aftermath thereof, but also as we think about things like poverty, as we think about, some of these adversities and these stressors in one's community, things like some of the things you all identified earlier, as we think about things like gang involvement, a lot of these things that carry not the greatest, not completing high school, teenage, pregnancy, etc. What is it like when that gets passed down from generation to generation? All right, so I'm going to share an article, and it is entitled Generational Trauma and the Cycles of Child Abuse. So this picture tells part of my story. I didn't have an early child pregnant. Also, and not surprisingly, given what we've talked about earlier, kind of parenting behaviors are transmitted through attachment and the epigenetic regulation of that genome. And so as we start to think about, I love kind of how Daniel Siegel talks about it. As we think about kind of this, kind of how parenting behaviors, attachment behaviors are passed down from one generation to the next. And really kind of thinking about this concept of we parent, and if we aren't parents, we likely have nieces, nephews, we may be working with kids. So how we caretake is in direct relation to how we were cared for growing up, unless we have done our own work and we've healed some of those wounds that we experienced by how we were taken care for and loved. And so thinking about this, what happens if we have individuals who are exposed
kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side? That's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily.